When you say to me, could you be wrong? My academic mind says theoretically yes, but practically no. Could I be wrong? It would be like asking me, John, you've been married to Sally for 58 years. Could you be wrong that she loves you? Well, theoretically, yes. But actually, the evidence all points in the other direction. And that's what I would say that I have built up in my life.
For those of you that don't know, that's John Lennox. He is an Oxford mathematician turned kind of apologist that is giving anything other than a mathematical answer to the question about his belief and if he could be wrong. He's giving a very emotionally persuasive answer because it sounds human and humble and relational, but it only works because he's asking us to borrow a kind of certainty that we have about one category of belief, in this case it's a marital relationship and or love, and transfer it to a completely different category, that of Christianity being factually and objectively true. Those are not the same kind of claim. It's a really strange bait and switch, but it kind of makes you sound like an asshole if you question it, because to question then is to, by way of the connection that he made, question the love that this almost 60-year relationship shares. And now you're just that stupid, evil atheist that, of course, can't ground love in anything and so probably doesn't buy into it in others. But we're going to try to give it more nuance than all of that, because there is a simple answer that what this boils down to is personal experience. He's calling it evidence, but he could be wrong about his wife loving him. I'm sure if we took a scan of the globe, there are many, many, many people that thought that their partner loved them even after decades of partnership and found out that that was not the case. I'm not saying John is one of those people, but to say that he couldn't be, or that we are supposed to borrow his same level of conviction in his trust for his wife to the credence of the religion being true, it just doesn't work that way. And again, it sounds a bit like a trained answer, because he's saying technically or theoretically, yeah, he could be wrong, but in practice, no. What I hear in that kind of an answer is that I want to sound humble. I want to say, sure, I could be wrong. I don't know anything. We're all just doing the best that we can, but nothing could convince me I actually am wrong. And then as soon as you have that second part, that faux humility goes out the window. And I want to back up really quick. Why am I even covering this? Why do I care? It is, after all, a personal question, and he is answering it in a personal way. And that would be fine. He's allowed to believe whatever he wants and for whatever reasons. But he is in the game of apologetics, and millions of people are hearing this conversation. And he is trying to equate it to evidence. And I think that can be hard for people to separate, which that's the answer to my question. That's why I want to talk about this. I want people to see where the errors can come in, where the fallacies lie, where it's not very logical or consistent. So let's start with why the analogy feels so strong. And it's because marriage is emotionally intuitive. And I agree that it would be weird for someone who's been married as long as he has been to be incorrect. It's not an impossible thing, as we stated earlier, but it would be strange after decades of communication and arguments and forgiveness and growth, all that daily interaction, all that repeated behavior. It would be odd to hear someone say, I could be wrong that my wife loves me. Of course, no one wants to believe that, but that doesn't actually equal reality and or truth. And I want you to hear what I'm saying. I'm actually giving credit to the analogy, because trust like that is rational. It's not irrational to take the position that he has taken about his marriage. The weak part of it comes in when he tries to connect it to his relationship with God. And again, from an apologetic standpoint, the evidence that that should supply for why people should believe that Christianity is true based off his word, right? Because he wants us to borrow confidence from him. This isn't just a chat between two people. This is evangelizing from John Lennox. He went on to profess the truth of Christianity. An important part of that is understanding how certain are you that this is the truth? Could you be wrong? And then this is his answer. So it's not just a personal answer. This isn't me just attacking the personal. I feel like we've been a bit redundant so far, but these caveats are incredibly important to hear why this actually breaks down later. So let's talk about why those claims are different. Trying to be thorough here. My wife loves me is a personal claim. Christianity is true is a worldview claim. In that worldview, we have to contend with a lot of other things. God existing, that humans have fallen, that there was a man named Jesus who was actually divine, that miracles occurred, that Jesus rose from the dead. You can get your salvation through that resurrection, through what he becomes as Christ, and that eternal destiny or consequence is dependent off of you believing that, understanding that, or applying that in some fashion. So no, not at all the same thing as, yeah, I believe that my wife loves me. Me too. But that doesn't mean that anything else I feel really confident of is all of a sudden true. It's also different categorically because of how you can test it. A spouse's love or commitment or trust is tested in a very different way than the claims of Christianity. And why I feel I can be nitpicky is because he could have used a different choice of words here. He could have said, I feel loved by God in the same way I feel loved by my wife. But it's more than him just saying that Christianity is meaningful to him, that his relationship with God is meaningful to him. He is saying that it is true. Such an important distinction. Also, a real relationship has feedback. Now, Christians are going to say, so does my relationship with God. But in general, we understand that the feedback between the invisible entity in the sky, or even the one living in your heart, or even the one that is supposedly omnipresent, is still very different than the physical person sitting across from you. You know how I know every Christian understands this perfectly? Because not one of them would ever masturbate when their grandma is in the room, but almost every single one of them has done that even though they believe Jesus is in the room. No, these are clearly different kinds of expectation for the feedback and the actuality of the presence of this kind of person. I'm sorry if that sounds like a crass example, but it's just the easiest one ever. If Lennox wonders or has doubts if his wife loves him, he can ask, hey, you love me, right? She can assure him. They can have a conversation. They can go back and forth. He can say, I'm confused because you say that, but you did this, and that communicated this to me. What would you say about that? And they can have a dialogue. She can correct him. She can show affection. She can give examples. Trust me, I hear your Christian brain saying God can do all those same things too, but it's so different, and it only takes this much honesty to admit it. With God, believers have to interpret his silence, their feelings, the scriptures, circumstances and coincidences, inner impressions, supposedly answered prayers, and even unanswered prayers as the relationship, as how God is speaking to them, or what's been revealed or put on their heart, or what they dreamt about last night, or a word that a friend gave them, and all of these other ways that are anything other than sitting down and being like, hey God, you said this and it's confusing. Break it down for me. And I've mentioned this before, and I kind of have my magnum opus episode coming on this particular concept, that if Christians really had the relationship with God that they say they have with him, instead of a Catholic debating a Protestant, they would both come together and say, hey, we both talked to God, right? Like both of us in our sermon on Sunday said we heard from God and he put this message on our heart and you preached it to a mass of people with all the certainty and conviction in the world. So if you both actually physically, truly hear from God in that way and dialogue with God in that way, get together and pray to him together and have him tell you right now on the spot which one. It's not a test to God. It's out of your own earnest, honest desire to please God and follow him and not lead others astray. Why would you not do that? And it's never, ever happened because God doesn't actually communicate. Thus, why the believer has to go through all of those other things I listed. The believer has to supply the interpretation to anything except physical speech and a real feedback loop of communication. If your spouse communicated with you the way that God supposedly communicates with people, no one would call that a healthy marriage, and divorce would be astronomically higher than it already is, because we wouldn't put up with that from a human partner, and for some reason we put up with it from the perfect God of the universe. Also, evidence has to be able to count against that relationship. It's not just about what evidence supports whatever it is you're claiming, but what evidence would count against it. And you pretty much just heard the admission from John. There's nothing that could convince him. In practice, no, he cannot be wrong about what he believes, which is based, as he said, on the collected experience that he counts as evidence over the course of his life. In other words, it cannot be falsified, and therefore it cannot be claimed as truth. Not in the objective way that apologists like Lennox want Christianity to be. The reverse of everything I said before is how you can bring it back to the wife analogy. If she never spoke to him, if she never said, I love you, if she abandoned him, if she mistreated him, this would all be evidence against the idea that his wife loves him and they have a trusting marriage. Where is that for God? So there's another reason why the comparison is not fair, that he is asking us to accept from him. And this could be fixed by Christians if they would just apply the same standards to their God as they do to any other lowly human. But God has a heads I win, tails you lose situation going on. If someone asks God for healing and he heals, they say, evidence, proof, God is good. And if he doesn't, they say, God is good. Wait, what? Well, yeah, he's still good. He's faithful. He'll help me through this. And if he doesn't, he's bringing me home to be with him. So again, unfalsifiable. No evidence can count against it. You are not having the same relationship with God that you have with other physical people like you're using in the example. That's just one example. A claim that wins when it wins and wins when it loses is not being tested. It's being protected. And that is a very different thing. And I want to get back to his, and I do think it's kind of a strange answer, his theoretically yes, but practically no. Because that answer does kind of work for some things. Can I be wrong that I exist? Theoretically, yes. Maybe you don't exist in the way you think. Maybe you're a simulation, a brain in a vat, etc. But practically no. Like, here you are. Again, it only really works in these weird philosophical scenarios. But Christianity and or the claim of Christianity doesn't function like that. Christianity simply is not one of those unavoidable beliefs that are required to function in reality, like the fact that I exist. If I don't accept that practically, even if theoretically it could be wrong, like this doesn't work. But billions of people live their lives, live good lives, have meaning, have morals, have joy, can forgive, etc., without Christianity. So then all Lennox is really describing with that is, again, his personal conviction, not the force of the evidence like he is asking for us to believe. And by the way, there's more context around this short. I'll link the entire interview below. So maybe I'm working off some things that weren't shown in the short, and for that I apologize, but you'll just have to bear with me here. You can probably guess one of the next points that I was going to make, which is that, hey, fine, if you want to use this line of argumentation, if you think it's good, if you think it's powerful, if you think it's rational, then you have to let every other believer in any other religion use it also. Could a Muslim be wrong about Islam? Theoretically, yes, but practically no. Would you accept that? Why not? After all, they have walked with Allah their entire life. What has been revealed in the Quran to them has lined up too coincidentally with their life experience to be mere coincidence. They tell you that the evidence all points in that direction. We don't even have to go to Islam or Mormonism or Hinduism or anything like that. Even the differences, again, within Catholicism or Protestantism or even Calvinism versus non-Calvinism, etc., like these things do make mutually exclusive claims against one another, and you have Christians using this same kind of personal experience evidence to back up why their version is the correct version, and none of them would accept it from each other but demand that others do. Like, it is hypocritical, and all it takes, again, this much honesty to say, it's just not a good argument. And that's really what this video is saying. Your personal experience is never a good argument for what you believe being true. And if you think that it is, you have to apply that to someone else. And if you don't, you're special pleading, that they're not sincere enough, that they've been deceived, whatever it is, well then how do you know that's not the case for you? The fact here is John is no different than anybody else. And the longer you believe something, the harder it is to believe you could be wrong about it. That's just a fact of life, a fact of psychology, what it is to be human, and we see him suffering from it. I really do believe that John can't fathom having been wrong about Christianity when it defines his marriage, his vocation, his friendships, the rest of his family connections, his public reputation, his intellectual legacy, all his personal suffering, all those years on his knees praying, his sense of purpose, his hope about death as he gets up there in age, what is his expectation for what comes next. Like, yeah, I believe you, bro, that you're convinced, but that doesn't count as evidence. And the only honest answer to could you be wrong is always yes. But he wants those evidences, as he called them, which are really just interpretations of experiences, to be the same thing, but they are not. This is always where there's like this weird thing when you question a Christian on this. They say, oh, you're questioning what, my honesty? Well, sometimes, sure. Lots of people are dishonest lots of the time. You being Christian doesn't change any of that. But no, even if I think you're the most honest person ever and you're recounting what you think are your real experiences, it's still the interpretations of those experiences. Experience can be real. Interpretation is the question. You pray and you had something that you consider to be wrong with you, and you consider that to be better after you prayed. In your mind, it's so clear. God answered your prayer. If God answers prayer, and that's a claim from the Bible, then you have evidence that this claim is true and thus that God exists. That all makes sense. But are there other explanations for what happened there? Of course there are. And again, it is only the dishonest person, the kind of person who would say practically no to that, instead of just saying, yeah, there's other things that could account for that. This is just my personal belief. And you're into the whole thing all over again. So when you've built an entire life out of these collections of experiences that you have interpreted in a certain way and then labeled as fact and added them up together as evidence, it makes sense why you can say something like this, but it doesn't make it true and it doesn't make it powerful. And again, it is destroyed by everyone else who has ever done the same thing that leads to a mutually exclusive outcome than the one that you are providing. So the better question here is always, what would change your mind? If you press them further to provide more of an actual answer, you're either going to get falsifiable statements, which are great, then we can start having a real conversation, or they're going to say, kind of like what John admitted to, nothing could change my mind. And then you're just a dogmatic believer like anyone else, including the believers in other religions that you don't agree with and or potentially even despise. This is what the real conversation should be about. Are you being honest? Are you being fair? And are you being consistent in the standards that you apply? I wanted to personally thank my top tiers of support: my Iconoclast, Anne, Chris, Greysteel, Jimmy, Joe, Kitboga, Lori, Matthew, and Perry; my Humanist heroes, Chris, James, Jarrod, and Kristi; my Atheist advocates, Aquitar, Caleb, Dakota, Dan, Jeff, Jeffrey, Jugs, Julie, Paul, Reggae, Sparky, and Thomas; as well as all of my secular scholar patrons and my new Mindshifter members. Your support allows this channel to continue to do what it does.